Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Claudia Webbe, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Leicester East. I'm of course delighted, and it's a pleasure to chair this necessary session today with an inspiring range of speakers. You know, the US government has been determined, as we know, to indict Julian Assange and WikiLeaks since at least 2010, when the group published hundreds of thousands of war logs and diplomatic cables revealing numerous war crimes and other acts of corruption by the US, the UK, and other governments around the world. The remaining 3 weeks of the Julian Assange extradition hearing are due to start on the 7th of September, and it's anticipated to last those 3 weeks. Julian Assange is charged by the Trump government with publishing the Afghan and Iraq war logs, for which he could face 175 years in jail. The human rights implications of this case are severe. Julian Assange lawyers have experienced a considerable amount of difficulty communicating with their client. We know this. The UN working group on arbitrary detention issued a statement saying that the right of Mr. Assange to personal liberty should actually be restored. Massimo Moratti of the Amnesty International has publicly stated that were Julian Assange to be extradited or subjected to any other transfer to the USA, Britain would be in breach of its obligations under international law. So Human Rights Watch also published an article saying the only thing standing between an Assange prosecution and a major threat to global media freedom is Britain. It is urgent, therefore, that we defend the principles at risk. We are fortunate today to be joined by 3 inspiring speakers. We have Joe Glenton, who is a former British soldier who was jailed for refusing to fight in Afghanistan. He's now a brilliant writer, campaigner, and activist. We also joining us today, we'll have Davies, who is an insightful investigative journalist, writer, and documentary maker. But first of all, we have we are fortunate to be joined by WikiLeaks editor-in-chief, Kristinn Hrafnsson, to discuss the effects of that war and the importance of the freedom of the press. So without further ado, I want to take us over to Kristinn. Thank you, Kristinn.
Thank you, Claudia. We are now, of course, remembering that 10 years ago today, on July 25th, 2010, WikiLeaks released the Afghan War Diary, the war logs from Afghanistan, which was, of course, an historic leak. It was a project where we had the media partners, The Guardian, The New York Times, and Der Spiegel. And it was the biggest leak at that time in military history. Of course, that was topped later in the fall in 2010. But on this day, the world actually got to see for the first time the entire truth about Afghanistan, which totally changed the narrative, in my opinion. Now, there were tremendously important stories, individual stories that were worked out of those documents. The 90,000 war field reports, of which many thousands were withheld. That come to mind, you know, the existence of a kill and capture squad, a death squad, basically, the previously unreported civilians' deaths that were hidden, which we know now that has happened in every war, and etc. I know that Nick will mention these stories in more detail probably later. He worked on that material for The Guardian at that time. But I mean, there are a couple of things that I want to mention in relation to this leak in general. I had been in Afghanistan a couple of times before 2010 as a reporter in 2008 and 2004. So I had a focus on sort of the reports and reporting that came out of Afghanistan throughout the years. And I think the general perception before and up to this time in 2010 was that things were going relatively well, that this was a winnable war. The year before, of course, we had the surge where Obama decided to send 30,000 additional troops into Afghanistan to sort of finish the job. Quite normal thing to do, I guess, if you just received an award like the Nobel Peace Prize to mobilize 30,000 troops somewhere in the world. But by 2010, in that summer, I think Afghanistan was a bit off the radar, and despite some concerns that the surge was not really going that well, I believe that the general perception was that this was somehow a mission that could be accomplished. That all changed on that day when these reports were revealed. And it's the entirety of these reports, when you combine it together, when you put it into graphics, you could show in such strength how things had been going from bad to worse throughout the years. It was definitely not going well, and now 10 years later, this is still going on, the longest war in US history, and far from being over. Another thing that I want to mention was what struck me by studying these documents is the reliance on human intelligence, the information from locals, which was led often to devastating deaths, even wiping out entire villages. We, of course, saw the same thing in the Guantanamo files, which were released months later, how basically false information or disinformation led to people being arrested and sent away and being tortured, and some killed. There seems to be a lack of awareness that the information was often presented with an alternative motive to settle some scores between tribes, villages, or just to get rid of a competition. So those are the sort of two things that I think was very important. The truth about the war came out that day, and I think it changed the entire perspective and the sight that people had on this mission. It was a totally failed one, and one that was unwinnable, basically, because it was simply no strategy, and there was a tough thing to actually acknowledge who was the enemy. And actually the military leaders, we now know through further leaks last year, that there was a concern about everybody taking part there, that this was basically an unwinnable war and a completely failed mission. I think I'll start with that. I would love to have comments later and questions about this and other leaks that are, as you mentioned, the basis of the indictment against Julian Assange. He is now facing basically death in American prison for the Afghan war diary, among other releases. He is basically being persecuted for giving the general public the truth about the war in Afghanistan.
So
thank you so much, Kristinn, for that opening and for presenting the basis of why we are here really today. We now are going to move to hear from an outstanding investigative journalist, writer and documentary maker. Over to you, Nick Davies.
Can you hear me? Will you wave if you can hear me? Good. Okay, I worked very closely with Julian throughout this period of investigating the Afghan war logs. The most important single thing to say is that the Trump administration's attempt to extradite and prosecute Julian is an intellectually corrupt, politically motivated abuse of criminal justice systems. And there is nothing good about it. I want to back that up by making two other statements. The first is to repeat what was said by Julian's barrister, Edward Fitzgerald, at the Belmarsh Magistrates Court hearings earlier this year, where he pointed out that although the Obama administration was extremely hostile towards Julian and WikiLeaks as a result of these publications, they were unable to produce an indictment and accepted that it wasn't possible to produce an indictment. For 6.5 years they tried and they couldn't do it because, crucially, US law doesn't allow it. Specifically, we're talking about the Espionage Act, which has been on the US statute book for more than 100 years. It has never been used against journalists. What you're seeing now is the Trump administration, with all of its corruption and dishonesty, using the intellectually corrupted Department of Justice, which it has stacked with its people, to distort American law, to put together an extradition and prosecution attempt, which is basically illegitimate. And the fact that the Obama administration, in spite of all its anger, couldn't bring itself to do it is bedrock here. Don't lose sight of it. This is not a legal attack. This is a political attack that is distorting law. Okay, so that's my first thing. The other is, which backs that up, just let's stand back from this and look at crime and the enforcement of law. And consider the fact that when we went through these Afghan war logs, we found evidence of US military killing hundreds, thousands of Afghan people. And I did a lot of work a few years ago on Vietnam, and US soldiers there talk about how they used to deploy the MGR. This stands for Mere Gook rule. A gook is the most offensive, racist expression that American troops used to describe Vietnamese men, women, and children. And the Mere Gook rule means you can kill them, but nobody's going to worry about it because they are merely gooks. The same was in Afghanistan. It's just like everybody now recognizes that within the borders of the United States, white lives matter more than black lives. Outside those borders, American lives matter. Everybody else's lives don't count. Afghani lives didn't count. So in the war logs, we came across 144 separate occasions when coalition troops, usually manning roadblocks, had mown down Afghan men, women, and children. I'm just going to disappear because I lost my glasses because I want to read you something. This is the point here is these are crimes that should have been prosecuted. If the Department of Justice was interested in enforcing the law, they would look at these hundreds and hundreds of murders and manslaughters and say, this has got to be brought to court. So I just want to read you a paragraph. This is from one of the stories we published at the time, based on these 144 different incidents we found of men and women being mown down, and children, at roadblocks, killing 195 people and wounding 174 others. There were probably more, but that's what we found. Bloody errors at civilians' expense, as recorded in the logs, include the day that French troops strafed a bus full of children in 2008, wounding 8 of them. A US patrol similarly machine-gunned a bus, wounding or killing 15 of its passengers. In 2007, Polish troops mortared a village, killing a wedding party, including a pregnant woman. Apparently this was a revenge attack because the Polish troops were angry. How many people did the US Department of Justice charge with murder? 0, 0, 0, none of it. But here comes Julian, the journalist who's publishing, who's helping us to publish the story, and they go around the world and spend hundreds of thousands of pounds to get him. How dare they call themselves the Department of Justice? And there's another element which Kristinn referred to, which is this outfit that the US military in Afghanistan set up called Task Force 373. This is a unit whose job is to kill people, or to be a little bit more explicit, to murder people. It's all bureaucratized in the way that the US military likes to, so that in Washington, they had this nice little group of people called the Joint Targeting Working Group. If you're on the ground in the US military or in the coalition in Afghanistan, you can decide to have someone killed, and you put together a target nomination packet. And you say the following guy should be killed, and you pass that up. And if the working group in Washington agrees, then TF373, this task force, will go out and try and kill you. Now, first of all, nobody on God's earth ever gave the US government license to go out and kill people it disapproves of. Doesn't even give them license to kill people who are committing offenses against them. It's what ordinary people call murder. And of course, because of the way they operated, they killed all sorts of innocent men, women, and children who happened to get in their way. So we found an incident in the logs where this task force set into a village at night to try and kill a particular person. Somebody in the distance shone a torch. They opened fire. They killed 7 people and injured 4. But when they went to investigate, they discovered that all of the 11 people they'd shot were Afghan police officers on their own side. So they're not being careful. There was another occasion where 10 days later, they went into a village to try and kill someone, and they're firing missiles into the village, and they hit a madrasa, it's a religious school. And when they get to the rubble, they found they've killed 7 people. All of them are children. One of them was still alive with its mouth full of dust. And they cleared out the dust from its mouth, and 20 minutes later it died. It has killed 7 children. Nobody gets prosecuted. I just want to read you about one other attack where they went into a village very near where they killed the 7 children. And they believe there are Taliban active in the village. This Task Force 373 goes in to kill them. And they call in air cover, and they drop these enormous 500-pound bombs on the village. The end result of this was 2 teenaged girls and a 10-year-old boy wounded. 1 girl killed, 1 woman killed, 4 civilian men killed, 1 donkey killed, 1 dog killed, several chicken killed. No enemy killed, no enemy wounded, no enemy detained. You just pause for a moment and imagine if a foreign army came to US territorial soil and did that. The uproar, the demand for law and order and justice and punishment, and they had utter impunity. And over again, with all of these cases I'm describing, whether it's shooting civilians at roadblocks or this murder squad, TF373, these incidents were either kept secret or they were the subject of press releases which were put out, which were utterly misleading. And therefore, we needed Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange and these media organizations to expose crimes being committed by the most powerful government in the world. And in all of this, the key point is that you're talking here about several thousand killings that should have been prosecuted as first-degree murder, second-degree murder, whatever you want to call it. None of them was. And yet they twist the mechanisms of criminal justice to try to come over after the person who made it possible to tell the truth about them. It is outrageous. That's it. I finished, but
thank you so much, Nick. Thank you for just laying that out in very clear terms. the case that you set out so well. And you know, we need to really understand the points that you have diligently pointed out, because these are the basis for what we are dealing with now. But before we go into a further debate on this, I just want to remind the audience that we have a question and answer process. You'll find the opportunity to pose questions. We will be able to come to your questions shortly. So please follow the question and answer, and if you've got a question to put, we'll try to answer it here today live, and or we'll provide a written response. I want to take us now to our final speaker for this panel. And our final speaker, just before we come to the question and answer session, is, as I've indicated, a former British soldier who was jailed for refusing to fight in Afghanistan, who is now a brilliant writer, campaigner, and activist. Over to you, Joe Glenton.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on. It's great to be on a panel of such admirable people. I was going to add, it's nearly 10 years to the day actually that I got out of jail, and since then, because of my taste in unappreciated and underpaid jobs, I've been a journalist for the most part. So I was back in Afghanistan in earlier this year. I made 2 films this year which yet to come out, one about Julian Assange and media freedom, and one about Afghanistan. And I assure you, just going off what Nick said, that the dirty war in Afghanistan, which is one of the things which is exposed in these logs, is still underway, only now it has an Afghan face. There are CIA funded militias doing the same job, and we met some of the families of the victims, including a young boy in a very tragic story who was killed near Jalalabad earlier this year. So that's very, very much still the case. But I should speak as a veteran, because that's the capacity that I'm here as. And I suppose as a veteran, I have this conversation with other veterans and people who are still serving. The WikiLeaks Afghan war logs, which came at maybe the peak of the Afghan war, showed us, it really highlighted the fact that the public at home didn't know what was going on. And it made public a version of the war which was familiar to us, but in a much broader way. It wasn't just the atomized experiences that we were trying to patch together of being a soldier for 6 months here. It wasn't just the individual thing, but it laid out the whole kind of breadth and nature and tempo of the occupation. And particularly for those of us who resisted it, and there were many, it showed that we were right to say that civilian casualties were high, which is often denied by the British government. We were right to say that there was a dirty war, a covert war underway, which very often departed from international law. And we were right to say that the insurgency there, when you look at the pattern of bombings, escalated because of our presence. Our presence became a lightning rod for the insurgency, and reinvigorated the Taliban and the insurgency, who had for the large part left before we entered in 2006. And I was in one of the first units off the plane in what we might call the second phase of the Afghan war, after it died down and the focus was on Iraq for a number of years. And it showed us that the public at home were misinformed. It was a very jarring experience to come home and try to explain to people what was happening, and all they had was the official narrative, if you like, which was generally, in many cases, MOD press statements which were just recycled about what was going on. In Afghanistan, it proved that we were right. And I can remember being a young soldier, drones going up and down the airfield, and my corporal saying, "You can't see that, it's not there." But of course, there was an expansion of the drone program, and so we were right. We were right to worry about that. It showed us patterns of shootings by British soldiers as well, particularly with reference to Nick's article, which I reread earlier, in Kabul and Helmand, particularly one by Royal Marines. And it showed us that civilian casualties were being brushed under the carpet. And it also showed us, and this is key, I think, for people who are in the military and who've served in it, who came back, in many cases, very embittered by the experience, that we were thrown into an unwinnable war with poor strategy, and it was deeply under-resourced by the Americans and by the British. And these are the kind of vital kind of details which were emerging. And it's also important that these logs, in the case of people who resisted during their military service after me, they gave soldiers the information they need, and sailors and airmen, to resist. There's a very important case in the UK of Mike Lyons, who was a medic due to deploy, who who resisted on the basis, in part, of what the war log said about what he would be expected to do, and he was shocked and resisted, and ended up in jail about a year after me for the same reasons. But a very, very, very noble stand there. And it allowed us, I suppose, on a more personal note, it allowed us that we could go and look at incidents, including incidents where people we knew were killed and injured, and we could assess those without the filter of the chain of command, or without, beyond just the MOD press release, another soldier has died, and the CO statement that he was a good lad. So it allowed us to look at those events without that kind of establishment filter on them. And I think for many of us that was very important. It was certainly the case for me and many others who lost friends there. I've again and again encountered and I think it's always important to address it, they're not journalists. Manning wasn't really a whistleblower, and Assange isn't really a journalist. And I often, when I came out of the military and prison and started to become a journalist, I was studying international relations. I picked up, as young journalists do, Randall's book, The Universal Journalist, and I was just revisiting today some of his tenets, his key tenets of journalism, and I won't go through them all, but just to take the top four. The role of a journalist is to discover and publish information that replaces rumour and speculation. Absolutely the case. Afghanistan and WikiLeaks did that. To resist or evade government controls. To inform and to empower voters. To subvert those in authority who rely on the lack of public information. They tick every box. They tick every box. So I want to try and bury, I'm sure it won't be buried just with my statement here, but try and bury this idea that these are not somehow proper journalists. It's not a proper publisher. It absolutely is. And I think some of the antagonism towards them is that in many cases, particularly from some people in the media, they were doing journalist jobs for them. Proper journalists, if you know what I mean, as some people tend to view themselves. But I'd also like to take a moment to I mean, I think the only soldier who came out of Iraq and Afghanistan covered in glory was Manning. And it's certainly a personal hero of mine as someone in uniform. Sometimes it's lost. I mean, this was a person who signed up to serve in good faith. And when you look at the politics of Manning and Assange, and they're often framed as some kind of rabid anarchists. And not, I mean, I know lots of anarchists, and some of them are very dear to me. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being an anarchist. I'm going to see some after this for a gin in the park. When you look at what they say, when you look at their motivations, their kind of politics, I think, has become very clear. These are very, very basic things which they're trying to conserve, which are like central parts of liberal democracy. We're talking about a commitment to free speech, freedom of the press, transparency, public debate, accountable government. These are basic tenets of any liberal democracy. These are not some kind of outsiders, and they have been othered to such a degree. These are people who, in my mind, seem to be concerned with really basic democratic rights, and who have both been harangued and harassed and abused and tortured, according to some people in the UN, psychologically and otherwise, for trying to just ensure we have basic functioning democracies. So it's really important to kind of clear those up, but also to say that for the war logs had a particular effect on soldiers and veterans, because it allowed us to see past what the chain of command says, past what the press says, and to put our experiences and our questions and our resistance in context. And it means that based on that, we can say, yes, we were right, those of us who resisted. And those of us who didn't resist but just questioned, we were right to say that. It was absolutely right. So I'm very grateful to the effort that was done by Julian and Chelsea. And it's disgusting to see what's happened to them since. And it's absolutely key that we defend them, because defending them is also a defense of our own rights as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Joe. And that brings us to the end of our panelists, and we're now going to try to open it up to questions. Whilst we've been speaking here as panelists, you have been putting your questions forward, and we've got some excellent questions to put to our panelists. One of the first questions says this: Julian Assange said that there appeared that there was evidence of war crimes in the documents. Were there any investigations and or prosecutions? I don't know who wants to take that question, but maybe we start with Kristinn. Do you want to go with that question?
Not to my knowledge, I don't think there has been any investigation into war crimes, and Nick Davies did touch upon that as well earlier. This is something that we of course have seen in other wars as well, in the Iraq War, and it is appalling to think that all this evidence is out there, and no one is held accountable for that. So that is the short question. Short answer to the question, sorry.
Thank you very much. Nick, I know you elaborated on that in your presentation. Do you want to add anything more to that?
The only thing I could add usefully actually deals with the next package of information which we all worked on from Chelsea Manning, which was the Iraq war logs. So first of all, where the Afghan war crimes are concerned, as far as I know, nobody has been prosecuted at all because of what I was saying earlier. In the case of the Iraq logs, there was a mass of horrifying material about how Iraqi security forces were torturing people, sometimes to get information, sometimes because they came from a rival religious group, sometimes as a form of blackmail. We kidnap your father, we torture him until you give us money. And it was clear from the reports, these reports are the US's own records of these torture incidents. There's no question that they know about them. One of them included the record of a video cassette being sent to US forces, which showed an Iraqi army major and his men taking a detainee out of the cell, beating him up and shooting him in the head. So this was the video of a murder taking place by their allies. Now, in the Iraqi case, it's not just that as a matter of practice, they didn't do anything to stop the torture or the murder. They didn't try and prosecute anybody because these are their allies. They actually had an internal order to which they could explicitly refer, which said, turn a blind eye to what the Iraqi security forces, because if I'd read it more recently, I could quote the number of it. But this kind of intellectual corruption actually formalized as a bureaucratic order. Don't prosecute the crimes which you're seeing being committed by our allies. So as far as I know, the answer to the question is none of these war crimes in any of these packages of war logs has ever been prosecuted by the US authorities.
Thank you.
And remember, Nick, as well, that we're talking about individuals that were actually handed over as detainees by the US military over to the Iraqi forces, and with the full knowledge that they were being tortured and killed. And but then they have this specific order not to intervene, but keep a good file on it.
Yeah, it is disgusting, outrageous.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it just really highlights the level of the injustice that we are seeing, and the fact that that Britain is also complicit in all of this, in the continued detention of Julian Assange. I want to go to another question, which I think is quite interesting. And this question relates to the notion of the leak and what it means for journalism, really. The biggest military leak in history while a war was still going on. I just want to ask you, Nick, if I might, what were the obstacles, and this question is asking, what were the obstacles of working on a database so big and so complex?
Okay.
And then if I can then go straight over to Joe. Joe, this one's for you. What was your experience being a conscientious objector at the time? So first Nick, and then straight over to Joe.
Okay, well, the two prime difficulties we dealt with. First, legal. If you're operating in the United Kingdom, you're operating in a very hostile legal context. And all the time working on this, we're aware that if the US Embassy knows too much about what we're up to, they go to court, they mumble the two magic words national security, and the judge will impose an order that will prevent us publishing. And if we defy that order, we're in contempt of court. There's no limit to the punishment that they can produce. They could fine us, say, £1 million a day and bankrupt the newspaper. So the whole thing is difficult to work on, because you're trying to check information at the same time as you're trying to keep it secret. So every time you approach someone, say, look, we're looking at this, do you think it's true? You're running the risk, you're putting the thing in jeopardy. So there was that awkward balance. But more fundamental was just the logistical fact that, as the questioner suggests, this was a huge database. And really, when you approach it, I mean, this is a grid, right? So there's just dates, incident numbers, location, number killed, number injured, one-line summary. It's a mess. So what you're doing is word searching it, and you're using the most powerful tool, I always say, that reporters have, which is your imagination. You're constantly, as a reporter, trying to guess what the truth might be, and then you're going out to check it. So you might try with a word like detainee or prisoner, and you might then get one reference, and then you can see the kind of internal jargon or code words that the US military are using. So for example, with the Task Force 373 who are going out killing people, if you start searching words like assassination and murder, you're not going to get anywhere, because the American military use these strange verbal strangulated ways of describing things. So they don't talk about killing people. They called it a personalized effect, a prioritized effect. That's their language for killing someone. So once we found that the language prioritized effect meant murdering people, you can search that. And they had this JPEL, Joint Prioritized Effect list, which was a list of more than 2,000 people they were setting out to kill. So it's about that. You use your imagination to guess what's there. You try and find keywords. You understand their language, and then you can break through and put fragments together and see a story. I hope that made sense.
That was brilliant. Joe?
Yes. I think it's interesting in this country when we talk about conscientious objection, because we always tend to think about it through the prism of World War I. And it's important here to point out that conscientious objection is a legal and contractual right. You can become a conscientious objector. There's a board for it. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you get to the board, as happened with in the case of someone I know, you will be accepted, but you are allowed to do it. My experience of it was that to be honest, most people in the military, my chain of command didn't really know what to do when I tried to object. I guess it doesn't happen that often. I mean, there are lists. There's been some work done, FOIs on lists, numbers of people who did it over Iraq and Afghanistan, but I believe it's still relatively low. So there's a lot of the context of the term is kind of mythologized, and also people don't generally know. When I moved for conscientious objection, as it were, they should have obviously passed me up chain of command and done that. But in terms of, I suppose you think about it in different ways, in terms of reaction from other people, a lot of people in the military were kind of on side. They were like, well, I'm not going to do that, but you are right. Afghan and Iraq were deeply dubious operations. So it's a strange thing. I do think the burden of hindsight, though, if I, as the 10 years have passed, if I had my time again, I don't know if I really conceive of myself as a conscientious objector. Really, that was kind of the label that was applied. But to be honest, when you look at movements within the military which have ended wars, such as in Vietnam, my time would probably been better spent organizing other soldiers and sailors and airmen to the degree that I could, rather than just individualized objection. So I think I don't know if that term fully applies to me in maybe the way it's traditionally meant.
Thank you. Thank you for that honest reflection there, really. So important. In terms of some other interesting questions, we've got a question about I'm not sure whether to put this question, but I'll put it anyway. But there's a question here from Deepa, who asks, what can be done to hold judges and the CPS to account for misconduct in public office? I think that's a much more wider question. But if we can narrow it down to the issue of Assange, I don't know if Kristinn you want to have a go at answering that question from the perspective of Assange?
You were breaking up a little bit, but I'm not certain I got the question. But it was about how we can hold the CPS accountable for work.
Yes, is it my signal? But yes, it's about how to hold the judges and CPS to account.
Well, I mean, that's I'm not a citizen of the UK, so I'm not sure what avenues can be taken there. But it is, of course, something that has come to our knowledge through freedom of information requests by, for example, the excellent journalists from Italy, Stefania Morici. It came to light that actually throughout the years when Julian was in the Ecuadorian embassy, the CPS was not just in the service of the Swedish prosecution at the time. It was basically in the driver's seat, and they were urging the Swedes to continue, even though they had wanted to drop the case at the time in I think 2013. The officials at the Crown Prosecution Service were telling the Swedes not to drop the case, not to travel to London to interview Julian. And there were quotes there in emails like, "Don't dare to get cold feet on us." So it was quite remarkable that this was going on, and it hasn't been investigated, it hasn't been explained. Maybe the new leader of the Labour Party could shed some light on it, because he was the head of the CPS at the time when this was happening. So, but on a wider scale, I mean, this will have very serious implication, of course, if Julian is extradited. It just cannot happen. It will have a very serious implication of the future of journalism worldwide on so many fronts. There is one thing that people are probably not aware of, is that the judges in London will have to decide that in order to extradite Julian, this will have to have been a violation of UK law. That's the same thing, that there has to be a parity in that, which basically means that there has to be an interpretation of the Official Secrets Act in the manner that journalists can be arrested for violating the Official Secrets Act if they receive classified information, receive and publish. So there's a lot at stake here, which that needs to be probed, and it's often quite overlooked in the media in the UK.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having a brilliant go at that question. I've got another question, if I might put this one to Nick, and maybe if you had something to say about the last question as well, you could cover it here as well. But the question I want to put to you is whether you could confirm if you think that there is a D notice on Assange which is preventing discussion of the case in the wider media, and the question is really asking, can we open up a discussion of a D notice being used to cover up crimes? So Nick, I don't know if you can have a go at that, and maybe just for the wider audience also just explain the notion of the D notice as well.
Okay. In the UK, there is a system where there is a D-notice committee, which tends to be composed of retired senior military personnel and some senior serving journalists. And it's often misunderstood, actually. This committee doesn't have any power. It can't say to a newspaper, you are not allowed to publish the following story. It's just an advisory system. And every so often they'll issue a D-notice and say, oh, let's say, for example, our nuclear submarines are patrolling in such and such an area. We'd be pleased if you didn't mention the precise location. And then newspapers can go along with that or ignore it. It tends to get exaggerated in people's minds because it sounds like a censorship system. Actually, it isn't. I spent 40 years as a reporter, and I focused quite often on exposing the activity of intelligence agencies, UK or US, and I never ever came across a D notice. So that's not what's at play here. I just wanted to kind of link up with what Kristinn was saying and just attack a central part of what's happening, which is the indictment itself. Going back to what I was saying at the beginning, the Obama administration couldn't put together an indictment because Julian's a journalist. So what the Trump people have done is to say, Julian isn't a journalist, therefore he is exposed to the Espionage Act and other law. And then what they've done is to accuse him of doing things which all journalists do all day long. So they've accused him of soliciting information which is secret. Any decent journalist tries to solicit, tries to persuade civil servants, police officers, intelligence officers, military personnel to talk so that we can find out what's going on behind the screen of secrecy. It's standard. Secondly, you know, there's this weird thing where they've accused Julian of conspiring with Chelsea Manning to hack into US military computer systems. Now, bear in mind, Chelsea Manning was being paid as an intelligence analyst. It was her job to have access to these systems. She didn't need to hack into anything. What Julian was allegedly, let's put in the word allegedly because all of this is up in the air. What is alleged here is that Julian said to her, I'm worried that you might get seen, that you're leaving electronic footprints here. If we could crack an external password, we could lay a false trail and make it look like the leaks have come to WikiLeaks from an outsider. Again, any journalist worth their pay will try to cover the tracks of the secret sources they're dealing with. That's standard, good journalistic practice, like soliciting information. And then thirdly, they say, shock horror, we say, this is the US prosecutors, you've jeopardized our national security. Governments always and everywhere try to preserve their unjustified secrets by accusing people of jeopardizing their national security. There just is no evidence that anything that Julian did or that we published has jeopardized their national security. There they are running all over Afghanistan, all over the world in the same way, sad to say, absolutely unchanged by what we did. So the basic body swerve by the Department of Justice to say, he ain't a journalist. Now we're going to accuse him of doing things that all journalists do. Number one, it's grotesquely unfair to Julian as an individual. Number two, which I think Kristinn was referring to, it's a threat to all journalists all over the world. This is the US reaching out with its power to try to nail an Australian citizen who was working in the United Kingdom. If they can get away with this and set the precedent, they will try to do the same, can try to do the same to journalists all over the world who dare to try to expose their history of criminality. So it's unfair on Julian and very dangerous to journalists generally because of the body swerve.
Thank you so much. That was so deep and so insightful and so direct and to the point in that analysis. And it's what we all really need to understand in terms of the context of this case. So thank you so much, Nick, for outlining that in great detail. I want to put a question now that I can open up, I think, to everyone to answer. And it's really this, and it's from Linda, and she says that there are some amazing supporters groups all around the world. How can we harness this power to be more effective? Is there a way we can mobilize and coordinate in a more structured manner so we can have a bigger impact? And I want to first, if I bring Joe in first, if I might, because I think, Joe, you also have a voice, not only as a powerful journalist, a writer, and so on, but you also have a voice as a former soldier. And I think that voice needs to be heard for other soldiers who are engaged in the military. So what would you say?
Well, in terms of the military, I suppose it's a difficult question. There's a lot of tensions there, because you would want, the aim would be to organise people to resist and refuse, and yet it remains the case at the same time that that a key tenet of the military mindset is that the politics are nothing to do with you. You keep it in house. It's not your problem. It's above your pay scale. So it's very difficult to organise. Particularly with a professional army. Obviously, we talk about the big waves of resistance among soldiers, Vietnam being the signal event. Of course, that was a conscript army, so it's a quite different thing, and it affected American society in a much broader way. It is very difficult, and also because the way we fight war, we don't have the mass or large-scale occupations like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, our military operations have been pared back to what some people call remote warfare, drones, special forces, militias, proxies, cyber, and so on. So it's a question which keeps me up at night. How do you organise soldiers? A key way to do that is to organise among veterans, and as I said before, a lot of veterans, not all. There's as wide a range of politics among veterans as in any other part of society, but a lot of people are deeply embittered by Iraq, deeply embittered by Afghanistan. There's another generation that are deeply embittered by Northern Ireland. And they're deeply embittered with the political system, like everyone else. So it's a route to talk to current personnel is maybe through former personnel. And there are all kinds of organisations in the States and here. Some of them are anti-war veterans organisations. Some of them are like more, I suppose, obviously left veterans organisations. But there is stuff, and I find in most of them, when we're going to talk about this particular case, Assange, and Manning, who is of course a veteran, figure highly in their politics and their plans and their discussions about what they do. Yeah, so I mean, if you want to speak to soldiers and influence them through families as well, we saw particularly with Iraq that military families resisted. A group of British military families, mostly women, mums of mum of a soldier who died, were very, very active, and in fact fought a fantastic campaign. And families, spouses, mothers, kids of soldiers have a particular power. So yeah, I think though, if you want to organise in the ranks or among the serving and ex-military community, veterans are maybe the best route, and families, I would say.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your insightful contribution in that regard. I just want to take that question also to Nick, and then I'm coming to you, Kristinn, if that's okay. So Nick, what do we do in relation to these amazing range of supporters around the world who want to harness the power to be more effective? Your thoughts?
The politics here are not good. Ultimately, you're up against the White House, whose indifference to the normal levers of democratic pressure are quite extraordinary. Demonstrations in the street, politicians complaining, newspapers attacking. Trump doesn't care. He doesn't respond in the way that standard democratic politics do. He might lose the election in November, but President Joe Biden is not going to do Julian any favors because of the Trump email disclosures and the damage they're perceived to have done to Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden comes out of the Clinton camp. If a Corbyn government had been elected in the UK, I think that they might, because you know that in order to extradite Julian, they need the consent not just of the courts, but of the government. Now, Theresa May's Home Secretary at the time, Sajid Javid, who's a man who doesn't happen to have a spinal column, signed off without even bothering to think about it. I think a Corbyn government would have rescinded the government's consent. As it is, we've now got fixed terms for Parliament. We're 4 years away from a general election unless something really weird happens. And by that time, it'll be too late. Even if we have a Starmer government, I doubt very much whether it'll take on the Americans. So the politics aren't great, but I don't think that means that all is lost. The interesting thing is, just very briefly, the High Court, the Supreme Court in the UK, used to be a nest of intellectual corruption, that same idea. And a lot of us in the 70s, 80s and 90s were fighting to expose horrible miscarriages of justice, those famous IRA cases and lots of others. And the courts wouldn't listen. They weren't interested in being fair. They just wanted to defend the police. The exposure of those miscarriages of justice traumatized the most senior judiciary in the UK. And there's a slightly different bunch in there. And I have very little faith in the magistrate at Belmarsh, but I do think it's possible that if and when this gets to the Supreme Court, they will smell the politics, they will see the bullshit, and they'll chuck the case out. So in a very, very difficult political situation, I think, oddly enough, the High Court might be our friend. And it helps a lot that Julian has got really, really good lawyers. Gareth Pearson, Edward Fitzgerald are top people, as Kristinn probably knows. So that's probably not very helpful, but that's how I'm seeing it.
Thank you so much. I think it's really, that perspective is really important. And just before I bring Kristinn in to answer that question, and I appreciate we're coming up to our closing remarks really, but just to let people know, as parliamentarians, of course, in the UK, we, some of us have tabled an early day motion in support of, seeking some justice and fairness in relation to Assange. I would encourage those of you in the UK and those of you who are across the world watching this today to put significant, if you like, commentary or pressure on members of parliament to sign that early day motion, because of course it's very important that we raise our voices in parliament. Nick is right in terms of the politics of this, but we shouldn't give up, and we should always push forward, and we should raise our voices for justice and the importance of journalism and investigative journalism, and the importance of the making sure that fairness is seen to be done, and that it's just. So over to you, Kristinn, on this issue of how we mobilize the power of many supporters, both here in the UK and across the world, who want to see change and who want to do something.
I just want to mention before that I go into that it is that I'm heartened by the fact that there is a growing understanding and a growing support for Julian, and people are in greater numbers now understanding the important issue that is at stake here, and this is something that I've been observing for the last 12 months since Julian was arrested. There is so much that people can do, and it's so hard to narrow down. They should, of course, as you mentioned, put a pressure on their MPs to support and sign the early day motion, and actually remind the politicians that this is such an important issue that they have to take a stand in that. I would want people to also demand of their media to take a more interest and cover it more extensively and more fairly, because it's such an important issue for everybody in the UK and in the world. And let's hope that the situation with the COVID will change, because and people can actually attend in person, and we will have events in the fall. Make your way to outside Old Bailey on September 7th, if it will be allowed to gather at that point. So it is certainly a winnable thing, because it is a terrifying prospect if Julian is extradited. It will be the biggest blow to journalism in the world in my time. Absolutely certain of that. There's no question about it.
Thank you so much, Kristinn. And I just really want to take this opportunity to point out to everyone that hopefully in the chat feature, if you can't see it, you will be able to hopefully get a link to the Don't Extradite Assange website, where more information is detailed about how action can be taken, including the need to be there on the 7th of September when the hearing begins, the last 3 weeks of the hearing. But I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers for their insightful contributions. I want to thank the organisers for enabling this event today. And most importantly, I want to thank you, the audience. I would just really like to finish by reflecting on some of the broader implications that the Assange case has for our democracy. The National Union of Journalists has stated that the US charges against Assange pose a huge threat, one that could criminalize the critical work of investigative journalists and their ability to protect their sources. This, I believe, is the most concerning aspect of the Assange prosecution. The change in document and accompanying extradition request from the US government seeks to criminalize numerous activities at the core of investigative journalism. The key allegation, as Nick has already outlined, that Assange helped Chelsea Manning to crack a password in order to cover her tracks is not new, but was long known under President Obama, who in essence chose not to prosecute Assange because this would amount to standard journalistic practice. Assange was recognized fully as a journalist. The indictment seeks to criminalize what journalists are not only permitted, but ethically required to do. That is the point of investigative journalism and journalism per se, which is to take steps to help those sources maintain their anonymity. It characterizes as a felony many actions that journalists must take in order to conduct sensitive reporting in the digital age. And Nick has highlighted this so well. As Assange is a deeply, of course, polarizing figure, the Trump Department of Justice hopes that animosity for Assange, because that is what the whole agenda is about. You in a sense, create this animosity for Assange, will personally, therefore, enable people to really be blind to the dangers that this indictment poses. Yet we must, I think, oppose together collectively this attempt to criminalize journalism that involves reporting on classified information. If not, this indictment could set a chilling precedent, which with grave implications, absolutely grave implications for the functioning of our democracy. So solidarity and thank you all.